speaker mode, that is.
Charlotte, was that a recommendation that on the recording that I put it in speaker mode?
So whoever's computer is recording, if they have it in speaker mode, the recording will only be of the person talking.
Interesting. Oh, yeah, like right now. Okay. Got
Thanks.
it. All right, I think you're ready, Tia.
Welcome to the Legal Cafe, everybody. This is a program we have at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. We hold it 3 times a month, usually at cafes or other community spaces, but now we've been holding them all online, and sometimes we have teach-ins like this one. This is a themed legal cafe where we will be doing part 2 of our mutual aid series. And I will let my coworkers introduce themselves, starting with Charlotte.
Everybody, I'm Charlotte Sweet, and I am one of the attorneys at Sustainable Economies Law Center. I primarily work with worker cooperatives and immigrant-owned cooperatives, and I'm excited to be presenting today.
Hello, and I'm Janelle Orsi, staff attorney and co-founder of Sustainable Economies Law Center. I work with cooperatives of all kinds, and I've also done work with various kinds of mutual aid groups, time banks, and awesome organizations over the years. Check.
And I'm Tia Katrina Tork-Myers. I'm the Director of Legal Education here at the Law Center, and I mostly organize these legal cafes and work on our communications team. On the slide, the parts of the presentation are color-coded by the person who will be presenting. As you can see, the first few sections will be by Janelle.
Shall I take it away then?
Yes.
Okay, well, before I go too far, I'm gonna linger on this slide for just a second. And while I do that, maybe I'll just ramble for a second. But yeah, we would love people to drop into the chat your name, where you're based, what mutual aid projects you're involved in, if any. And if you've come with any questions today, drop those in too. While I'm presenting, I'm gonna actually ignore the chat. So Tia or Charlotte, maybe you could flag me down if anybody needs my attention. So yeah, by the way, I think this is the 5th presentation we've given about mutual aid, and every time we do it, it's a little bit different, or maybe a lot different. We started it like right after the pandemic hit, and we knew that a lot of mutual aid groups were coming out of the woodwork. But yeah, just a disclaimer that this presentation is a little bit of a work in progress. We keep refining it. We have conversations with mutual aid groups, learn about what their needs are, and then we refine the presentation in response to that. So that's just a little bit of a disclaimer of where we're coming from and where we're at while we linger on this slide. But anyways, hopefully people will start dropping stuff into the chat.
They are. We have mutual aid groups from Arkansas, Oakland, El Cerrito, Colorado. Everyone's introducing themselves. I know you can't really see it when you're in presenter mode.
Yeah, thank you. That makes me happy. So the other thing that makes me happy is keeping track of all the new mutual aid groups that are emerging around the country. There's a couple folks who have tried to create lists of them or aggregate them. Mutualaidhub.org has created a really amazing map and has been keeping pretty good track of groups. They also have been convening groups and having many weekly discussions, and they have an online Slack where groups can share best practices. And most of the groups that have emerged are new. They're not existing organizations doing mutual aid work. They're new groups that have emerged, mostly as a result of the pandemic. So it's a pretty amazing time, and of course, a lot of interesting legal questions coming up. Mutual aid, it's suddenly a phrase we're hearing everywhere. There's maybe not a clear definition of it, but in general, what we're seeing is that these are organizations, people coming together out of solidarity, not a sense of charity or like trying to save the downtrodden. Also not motivated by profit, but basically people who see their well-being as bound up in that of others, and they're working together to meet everyone's needs. And then the aid is taking all kinds of forms, which is the very first thing that we're hearing a lot about is money is moving. People are giving each other money, sometimes lending each other money, but also doing all kinds of favors for each other, helping create work for one another. Today, we're going to mostly talk about money because that's where a lot of the legal issues come up. And here's that map that I mentioned. So you could see it's just sprouting up everywhere. And this is how I feel about it, because it just gives me so much hope to see how quickly people have gotten organized, how much generosity there is, how much creativity there is, and courage. Courage, because a lot of people are doing this whether it's legal or not. You'll hear more about that in a second. But this is part of why I'm so excited about it, is because this feels like a movement that could start to form the foundation of our next economy, of politics, of culture, if we get it on solid legal ground, which is part of why Sustainable Economies Law Center has taken such an interest in it. We were also recently learning about Depression-era cooperatives. There were just tons of them serving so many people, helping to create jobs, helping ensure people had food. And if this could be, you know, another time where a cooperative movement flourishes. And so we really want to support that. Oh, and by the way, this is an article I recommend, which is just about how powerful it can be when we start to get organized and we stay organized. Like, we build the foundation of our next economies by creating like permanently organized communities. So check this out. And by the way, from time to time, Tia is going to drop the link to the slides into the chat, so you can even click on them, follow along, click on things that you see linked in the slides. And one other thing to know is that some of this is going to be very information dense, and we're not going to slow down to cover it all, but we're going to highlight what's there so you can come back later and read it. And there's also slides from our first presentation in this series that you can come back to and review. So we are lawyers, we're a legal organization, but also need to acknowledge that lawyers are playing a little bit of an awkward role at this moment, because this is a movement that's doing a lot of new and creative things, and we need to figure out where it fits legally. So the movement needs lawyers. On the other hand, a lot of mutual aid groups, let's just face it, are going to be best served if they do not listen to the lawyers, because of all the legal barriers that we would end up creating that would slow down some of the really important work that's happening right now. So, you know, keep that in mind. And here's a helpful quote that we can all keep in mind, which is that if it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. And a lot of what people are doing for each other, what people are organizing right now, it's the right thing to do. Like, we know that in our hearts. But whether or not, you know, it's complying with all, like the tax laws, for example, that's a different question. So as I mentioned, we've done this presentation a few times, and the feedback we've gotten is that in a couple of our past presentations, we've gotten ahead of ourselves a little bit. Like, we started running down all these different financial regulations that are gonna be relevant when like people and organizations start doing lending and that kind of thing. But right now, what we're mostly seeing is people giving money, not lending, giving money to each other to meet immediate needs, so short-term, smaller gifts. And people doing favors for each other. But what I expect we're going to start to see in the longer term is that new organizations and enterprises are going to start to emerge and solidify from this, and that they are going to have a lot of ongoing legal needs. So for the sake of not overwhelming people, this presentation is mostly focused on what we're calling first wave legal needs, like the first wave of mutual aid. These are a lot of the questions that we've heard come up. This is the order in which we're actually going to present about them today. And the second wave legal needs are the ones that are going to start arising when we start forming more cooperative structures, we start trying to establish larger backbone organizations for the movement, where we start using other kinds of 501Cs beyond 501C3, and that different kinds of financial transactions will be taking place. So we're not going to talk through all the law of that today because it would just overwhelm us. But sneak preview, I'm going to just go right past this slide. But these are the kinds of laws that eventually this movement is going to need to grapple with. Okay, so let's start talking about the stuff folks might need to know. Tax. Well, we just dive into the fun stuff, right? Okay, we tried to make it not too painful to talk about tax today with the help of our intern, Erica. I was like, Erica, can you help make this less painful, maybe use some colors, some graphics, and voila, here we are. So this is how we're kind of envisioning the movement of money. And this is what we know to be happening is money starts somewhere. So over here on the left side of the screen, the money's coming from individuals, from organizations and businesses. In some cases, it's making a stop along the way. That might be a new mutual aid group that's receiving the money, or an existing organization, or even an individual. And then it stops when it gets to the recipient, which is individuals, businesses, organizations. And so at every step of the way, there's a little bit of a question of, okay, is there a taxable income moment happening here, or is there a tax deductible moment? And so we're gonna just talk through it, but I'm gonna go through it fast because there's a lot to talk about, but I'm gonna try to highlight some of the key takeaways. So let's go ahead and jump all the way to where the money is gonna land. So it arrives with, let's start with an individual. This is the most common thing, is individuals are receiving money right now in different forms. One way, so the question is that individual receiving taxable income? One way in which it's not taxable income is if it's a gift. So under the tax code, if something is a gift, it's not taxable income, but you have to know what a gift is. And a gift, it's got a specific definition that's been mostly established by this Supreme Court case. And the gist of it is, right here, that it really needs to come from feelings of generosity by the donor, and that there be no expectation of something in return. And by the way, we recently had some pro bono attorneys collect all kinds of case law on gifts and what is the definition of a gift. So if you can click here on that slide and see all of that fascinating case law. So yeah, if you wanted to give money to someone and put any kind of strings on it, strings attached, then there's a risk of it not being a gift, and that means there's a risk of it being taxable income to the individual. So keep that in mind. Okay, another basis on which it's not taxable income to the individual is if it's a qualified disaster relief payment, which is something that you can do right now because we have a federally declared disaster. This is for individuals. And the next slide has some information about what those payments can be for, what's covered, and what's not covered. So you can come back and review this. So that's for individuals. Let's move on to businesses. Can a business or organization receive a gift, as I was talking about? We just did a whole lot of research on this, and it turns out yes, which makes us really happy. Yeah, so basically people can have a sense of generosity, feelings of generosity toward a business, because if you think about it, a business is often just a group of people. Corporations are people too. That's sort of the basis of it, but it is actually kind of rare for a court to agree that a gift to a business is a true gift, because usually if people give money to a business, there is some kind of strings attached. So keep that in mind. Now about the qualified disaster relief payment, just learned this today actually. This is part of the disclaimer is we are all learning this stuff very fast, and sometimes we're presenting about something about 30 minutes after we learned it. So here we are. It appears, and let us know if we're wrong, it appears that a qualified disaster relief payment cannot be made to a business and be tax-free. So that's a bummer, because I know a lot of people would want to give aid to businesses right now. But if you're a business, you have another option, which is if people are giving you money, the way to not pay taxes on it is to spend it, because then you have a tax deductible expenditure, and you might at the end of the year have a loss or just very little net taxable income. So it's not such bad news for businesses. Okay, 501c nonprofits, if they're receiving money, that's the nice thing about being a 501c nonprofit is you're tax exempt. You rarely pay taxes on income. There's some exceptions, but especially if it's a donation, it's unlikely to be taxed. So that part's easy. Okay, let's go back over to the other side to where the money begins and what some of the tax considerations are there. And if we're talking about individuals, honestly, the tax considerations, there's not much to talk about unless you're a wealthy person making large gifts. For example, if you're making a gift of $15,000 or more to an individual or business, then you need to report that gift on your taxes. but you're not paying taxes on that, at least not immediately. It will only be if you have a giant estate worth 11.5 million or more when you die. So yeah, so this gift tax return thing is probably not going to be relevant to most people unless they're making really large gifts. The other thing is, if you're making gifts, do you need that charitable deduction? Well, it turns out, especially since 2017 and our tax bill, that very few people now can benefit from charitable deductions. Almost everybody in the United States now takes the standard deduction, meaning they don't itemize. So that means if you're making a donation, it doesn't matter if you're donating to a 501c3 or to a cooperative or to a business, it's going to be all the same for tax purposes. How about for businesses that want to contribute? There's a couple ways that businesses can make it tax deductible. One is as a charitable donation to a 501c3, and another is as a business expense. So be sure if you're a business that you know what is a qualifying business expense. But just so you know, if you're making payments of aid, disaster relief payments to your employees, that is a deductible business expense. Okay, so a few considerations for 501c3 nonprofits that are making gifts, especially to businesses and individuals. If you're a public charity, which is most nonprofits that people are familiar with, the IRS wants to know that you just have a system for keeping records, for making sure that you have some sort of standardized criteria for selecting people, that you keep records of people's eligibility. They just ask you a yes or no question, and you preferably want to say yes, you have these records and criteria and such. So if you're going to start doing this, create some kind of internal policy and procedure for doing it. If you're a private foundation, there's even more responsibility for doing oversight and checking up on who you're giving money to if you're giving to somebody other than a 501c3. So a couple other things for 501c3s, making aid payments. Private benefit is something that 501c3s are supposed to avoid. Well, but really, if you think about it, if you're giving money to an individual, that is private benefit to that individual. What you need to show is that it's really, the private benefit is incidental to what you're trying to do, which is achieve a charitable purpose. You're giving money to a person in need, helping relieve their distress, and the fact that it benefits them is kind of incidental to that, if that makes sense. And then conflict of interest policies. The IRS generally wants 501c3s to follow a policy where if you're giving money or paying money or hiring an insider, like a staff or board member, that you have a really clear deliberative process for making sure that that's in the best interest of the nonprofit. Okay, so here's some interesting thing that we've been racking our brains about, getting a lot of advice from other lawyers about, is a thing that we know to be happening quite a bit, which is mutual aid groups around the country. Individuals have basically stepped up and volunteered to use their own personal bank accounts to collect money and then pay that money out, which if you think about it is rad because this money needs to move quickly and it takes a long time for a new organization to get set up and start a bank account. So it's like money has to move. People are using their own bank accounts. So then the question is, is that taxable income to the individual? Well, there's three possibilities, and this is where I'm gonna just sort of gloss over stuff and encourage you to come back and read the slides if this is actually relevant to you. But basically, one possibility is the individual reports the income. That might not be so bad because if you think about it, the payments that you make from that income, you can maybe consider them to be business expenses. I don't know, this is how I'm thinking about it anyways. I would appreciate feedback if I'm wrong. But you wouldn't want to do this forever. Maybe you could do this for 1 year, but if the IRS sees you do this year after year, they're going to say this is not a real business, this is a hobby. But anyway, so an individual reporting it may not be the end of the world, but it's probably not preferable. Another possibility, and this is the one that I think is probably ideal for the individual, is to recognize that they're not really receiving money and they don't really even control it. They're acting as an agent for a group of people or an organization that's helping get that money out to the people who need it. So it means the individual doesn't have the taxable income, it means the group does, whoever that group is. And if the group is an unincorporated group of people, it needs to figure out its tax status. And Tia is going to talk a little bit about that. There's a little typo here, but you want to either choose 501c3 or C4 if you want to be tax exempt, or just pay tax like a business where, again, you might not have taxable income. So here's a little bit of the law that our intern gathered just this week on agency law, and we have a little translation of it, which is basically when you're collecting funds on behalf of someone else and you don't control those funds, then it's not actually income to you. You can come back and read some of the cases and the factors to consider. Something similar to agency law is trust law, and we didn't do as much research on that, but that might be another theory where the individual is acting as a trustee for the benefit of a group of people. There is a third possibility, though I would say it's a stretch, which is that neither the individual or the group have to report the income, that they're all serving as agents to get money from one person to another person. But if that were the case, why not just ask the one person to give the money to the other person? But this could be a possibility, so I wanted to flag it. Okay, so other places where the money could stop along the way, businesses might be collecting funds, and which is similar to an individual. You want to either report the income or act as an agent of another group. If you're a 501c3 receiving money and then helping disperse it out, on the receiving end, a couple considerations are that if you're receiving all of a sudden new large sums of money, particularly from a single donor or a small group of donors, it could jeopardize your public charity status. Like the IRS wants to know that you have a broad range of public support, and not that you're just like like unduly influenced by one or a few major donors. So keep that in mind. And also, if a donor gives you money and says, I want this money to go to that person, like they want you to earmark it, you really shouldn't be doing that. But you can sort of loosely take their advice. You might want to look into, if you're going to be doing something like this, the rules around donor advised funds, where the donor can have some influence into where the money ends up. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. That was long. All right, so remind me, Tia, are we trying to go until 6, the presentation until 6, or a little bit before? Okay.
Yes, we can go until 6.
All right, cool.
Even a little past.
Okay, and you all have about 20 minutes of presentation, meaning I might have 20 more, or 15. Okay. All right, so here's a question that's coming up a lot is, can 501c3s facilitate mutual aid? Because as we said early on, mutual aid really isn't happening in the spirit of charity. It's like people coming together to benefit themselves and their own communities. So I'm going to basically offer the argument that we would put forth that we feel is pretty strong. Here's the argument why 501c3s, yes, they can facilitate mutual aid. And then there's also a good argument that they should. Even if they're not, I would say they're not maybe always the best fit as organizations, but what we have is a gigantic nonprofit sector. Lots of organizations that are already set up, they have the infrastructure. And so it would be ideal for many existing 501c3s to retool right now and facilitate mutual aid. And if we had a much larger cooperative sector, we could be using that cooperative sector, but it's not that large yet. Okay, so here's what you need to know is that 501c3s, they really need to exist for charitable, educational, religious, scientific purposes. And there's been sort of well-established understandings of what those are. But those boundaries are not true boundaries. They expand over time as we begin to rethink different forms of charitable activities. And what is charitable changes with reference to what are the problems in society that we're trying to solve right now. So that's why we feel like the boundaries of 501c3 are currently expanding to include mutual aid, because it's really paramount to averting disaster right now. So as I mentioned, let's look at the word charitable for just a minute. The IRS defines it to include these various things like relief of the poor, distressed, and underprivileged, combating community deterioration. These are all things we're working very hard to do right now. But within these boundaries of charitable, there's some ways in which the IRS gets kind of wary, like you might be going out of the boundaries into areas that are not good. One of those is if an activity is too commercial. But what we've seen is that when there are major market failures, the IRS is much more willing to grant tax exemption as a charitable activity to things that look more like businesses. So let's say we have community food buying clubs that start to look like grocery stores right now. Maybe one of the reasons that's happening is because the food system and the supply chains are breaking down, and this becomes necessary to meeting people's needs. So that's to say, like, a lot of these activities could, even if they start to look commercial, still be considered charitable. The other space in which the IRS considers there to be a potentially inappropriate boundary crossing is if there's too much private benefit to like private individuals. But you know, if you're a part of a charitable class of people, what the IRS calls poor, distressed, or underprivileged, then providing aid to someone in a charitable class advances the charitable purpose. So what we have also right now is a very enlarged charitable class. A lot of people are at risk right now. It's not just people who are typically low income. It's a lot of people who are threatened right now. In charitable class, we've found to be very context specific. The IRS changes its definition with reference to different kinds of threats that people are facing. Now, within the private benefit, this is where mutual aid really comes up as a question, is that the IRS really doesn't like it when there's private benefit to insiders, aka inurement. So if you think about it, that's kind of what mutual aid is people coming together to benefit themselves. So at first glance, it would seem like a 501c3 is an awkward fit for mutual aid. And in fact, there's even case law or revenue rulings, as they are called, that makes it sound like people can't come together to help themselves. But this ruling right here is an old ruling where it says a group of low-income families can't create housing for itself, that would not be a charitable purpose. They said it would be fine if someone else created the housing for them, or if they created the housing for someone else, but not for themselves, which is annoying and frustrating. But again, the law evolves over time with reference to and response to the current circumstances. And we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. And we even have a Nobel Prize winning economist who's looked at communities all over the world and said, here's what works, here's what sustains a community in the long term, here's what best meets people's needs. And what she concluded was that community self-determination is the key factor. She came up with these principles that said, you know, if this is going to, you know, if a community is going to be able to effectively manage its resources, there needs to be participatory decision making by the, you know, people who are using the resources, group autonomy. So this really points to mutual aid being the most effective way to combat community deterioration, to alleviate poverty. And if you think about it, you just can't have a system where you divide every activity into, this is an activity where we help other people, and this is an activity where we help ourselves. In nature, everything, all these things are always combined. We're just all part of an ecosystem that thrives together. So it makes sense from a natural, like, metaphor standpoint that mutual aid can advance charitable purposes. So this is more or less summing up the argument of the crisis that we're in, and the fact that even if we have bad case law from 50 years ago, there's very good evidence that we could have new interpretations that focus on community self-determination, mutual aid, self-help, whatever you want to call it, as being the best way, the most efficient, effective, responsive, adaptive way to combat community deterioration and advance charitable purposes. Okay, so that's the bit about why 501c3s can and should support mutual aid right now. So governance is another really big question because the decision making around how resources are going to flow, you're going to want it to be, you know, responsive to what's happening, preferably not top-down decision making, but groups of people making decisions for themselves, preferably efficiently. And what this means is that we really need to focus on small scale groups, or in the case of larger organizations, decentralized structures that enable small groups of people to work together and decide together, because smaller groups are the only ones that can really tune into people's immediate needs and respond to them as they change. And if we have groups that start to get bigger and bigger, we'll probably need to create structures that allow them to break up or multiply. So what we need is, first of all, clear agreements about what a group is and how it functions. And they can be pretty short agreements. They preferably should be, because people don't have the time or patience to read long documents. Here's a slide that you can come back to that I put together to just summarize some of the kinds of things you would want to have in a group agreement. A few of these are pretty important, like how do people join and how do people leave, because the boundaries of a group are pretty important, like people knowing who's in or who's out. That's what Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winning economist, said. This is one of the really key factors, is having clear boundaries. You can allow people in, but still make clear like when people are in or not. Also making clear who's making decisions, and if there are subsets of people making decisions, like a committee or a board, how do people join that group or that committee? What's the decision-making process? Hopefully it's not just like, here's a proposal, let's vote. Hopefully it's gonna be more participatory, where everybody will be able to weigh in, and hopefully adapt the proposal as it goes so that people are ultimately happy with what the decisions are. Conflict engagement, conflict resolution. This is a really big one, because as I mentioned, what a lot of people are organizing right now may not all be in compliance with the law. And if people are starting to have disputes with each other, you're probably not going to want to use the legal system to sort it out. So, and also as far as, building good relationships and trusting organizations, you want to have a good system where, if problems surface, that there's already clear understanding of what's the process for engaging with that problem. So, all right, so this is another thing that's come up a lot. This might seem kind of specific, but a lot of 501c3s have been asking us, like, how do we enable these mutual aid groups? If a mutual aid group is happening under our umbrella, like, isn't that going to create all kinds of conflicts of interest or private benefit issues? And so today I was just kind of like typing, trying to figure out, like, if I were a 501c3 facilitating mutual aid, what kind of policy would I want to have on our books? And so this is like a key point, is most of the time when nonprofits give away money, they have this kind of top-down decision making. They have like objective criteria, eligibility for who gets the money, and then they have a decision making body that's different than the people who are getting the money. Here with mutual aid, what we'll often have is a group of people deciding on money that they themselves will receive, along with a group of other people who might receive aid. So it's pretty different, but there's a really good argument that it's the best way to do it. And that's kind of what I wrote right here, which is that instead of adopting objective criteria, the best way to do this is to steward formation of small groups that decide the aid for themselves. And that this is going to be the most adaptive to the changing times. It's going to be the most tailored to people's individual needs. And the other thing is, it opens the door for people to get creative. Like a group of people trying to help each other, they're not going to just be giving out money. They're going to say, hey, borrow my car, or hey, my friend is hiring somebody. They help each other out in ways that are more than about money. So in other words, it's going to even more effectively advance charitable purposes if you have groups of people helping each other rather than a top-down aid situation. And the role of the organization is to kind of step back and just provide a little bit of light touch oversight, like make sure the group is being accountable, that they're following their own participatory decision-making structures. And the nonprofit can provide the administrative backbone in terms of like being able to receive and administer funds, which is the need that a lot of these groups have. And then the 501c3 to, just to make sure that the groups are accountable and participatory and making good decisions that are actually responsive. The 501c3 would probably want to have some minimum requirements for how the group operates, including maybe some requirements around how big the group can get, how often it meets, what decision-making process is used to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. So this slide here is a little bit of a work in progress, but I feel like a lot of 501c3s are needing something like this right now. And I do, as I mentioned, encourage many existing nonprofits to consider adding mutual aid as a core activity, facilitation of mutual aid, I should say. Okay, so those were my parts. Shall I stop sharing, or do you want me to just?
Yes, and then I'll share.
Okay.
And while I'm pulling up my slides, Buddy had a question for you about disaster relief payments and if it's only tax exempt gifts from businesses if it's to employees.
No, it's to other individuals as well. Oh, you mean is it tax deductible if you give it to other individuals, people other than your employees? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. Yeah. Yeah, and this is not actually for mutual aid. This is for I'm a part of the Merit Student Government, which is a 501c3, and we're trying to organize food redistribution and get donations and like from businesses and allocate it to students. And I'm just wondering, yeah, if that could be counted as a tax deduction for these businesses.
I think so, but I want to put a pin in that one and say, looking at the rules around what can be considered a tax deductible expense for a business would probably be a good idea. But it feels like that should be, like, if the purpose of the activity is to buy food and provide it to people, it's like a cost of goods. Yeah, it feels like it should be. But yeah, I can't give you the exact wording or reason why.
Okay, and maybe is there some way that you could point me towards like protocols that we should set up for this, like, or where I can like find more information on this specifically? I don't want to take up any more time with it, but would love to know what my next step should be.
I don't know if I could answer that right off the cuff.
We could maybe talk about it in a breakout room.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Okay, so should groups formally register or incorporate? Well, most of the mutual aid groups we're encountering are informal groups of people finding solutions all by themselves. But as we approach our 4th month of shelter in place, groups are getting bigger and more complicated, and they might be wondering if they should formally register or incorporate. Some of the major reasons groups decide to register, one of the major reasons is that if you don't register, then your group is automatically an unincorporated association. And that means you don't have a liability shield. And that means that someone who sues your group and wins can reach the assets of the group and also the personal assets of the members, such as your car, your bank account, your home. But if you incorporate, the members of your group get a liability shield. And Charlotte will discuss how to reduce liability and risks later, even without incorporating. We don't want to scare you. Some other reasons people register include establishing credibility, or they think that they might have to create an entity to open a bank account. Just note that you actually don't have to. Some bank accounts allow you to open an account. Some banks allow you to open an account even if you are an unincorporated association. And finally, some groups decide to incorporate for tax exemption purposes. But do you really need tax exemption? Of course, it's nice to avoid taxes if you're bringing in a lot of money, but you only have to pay taxes on net income anyway. A lot of groups are just going to be bringing in money and then putting that money to use and have zero net income. So tax exemption might not even be super important. There's also fundraising to consider. It might be hard to get grants if you're unincorporated, and it might also be hard to get donations if people can't make tax deductible donations. But if you do want to avoid paying taxes on your group's net income, then getting 501c4 tax exemption might be a good option. A 501c4 nonprofit organization is one that operates exclusively to promote social welfare and must not be organized for profit. It's easier to obtain 501c4 tax exemption than it is to obtain 501c3 exemption. All you have to do is file a notice of intent, and you can do this easily online. If you're following on the slides, we put the link to the website to file your notice of intent in the slides. Just note that to obtain 501c4 tax exemption, you must file this form within 60 days of formation. Otherwise, you may be penalized $20 per day. Also, even though you can avoid paying taxes as a C4, most foundations still won't grant to C4s, and donations to your org won't be tax deductible. So if you do want to go for those tax deductible donations and foundation grants, we have a few ways to get 501c3 tax exemption quick and easy. One is by forming a nano nonprofit. And this happens automatically. Even as an unincorporated association, if you have a charitable purpose and your gross income is less than $5,000, then you get automatic tax exemption. The term charitable, as Janelle mentioned earlier, includes relief of the poor, the distressed, or the underprivileged, lessening the burdens of government, etc. In other words, most mutual aid groups can argue that they have a charitable purpose. Just note that you will have to file a 990 card each year. Another way to fast track becoming tax exempt is by filing Form 1023-EZ. You can only do this if your group will have less than $50,000 per year in gross receipts for the next 3 years. You could also go the old-fashioned way by filing Form 1023. It's the complete form, and it's about 28 pages. And you can do it with an expedited request. And finally, you can find an existing nonprofit and ask them to fiscally sponsor your project. Just beware that this phrase, fiscal sponsorship, applies to more than 6 different kinds of relationships. And so for more information, please read our bite-sized legal guide on how to receive grants and donations through a fiscal sponsor. And in the comments to this slide, we have a link to that bite-sized legal guide. Now, we do have reasons not to incorporate. One is it's expensive. It takes a lot of time that could be used helping each other. There are so many laws. If you form an entity and don't follow the formalities, you are potentially worse off than if you had stayed informal. Remember that liability shield I mentioned earlier? It's one of the major reasons why people decide to incorporate. Well, it's actually pretty common for business owners to be held personally liable for their company's debts, even if they incorporated. It's called piercing the corporate veil, and it happens when groups fail to follow corporate formalities, which they often do, when they commingle assets, or when they engage in fraudulent behavior. And one last reason why you might not want to register is incorporating could shift the vibe or the culture of the group. A lot of what's happening now works not because people are donating for tax benefits or because foundations are helping out, but because people care about each other. We're seeing a communal or familial kind of vibe of people making decisions based on what's right and what's good. And the culture from which mutual aid is blossoming often criticizes the role of charities and the nonprofit industrial complex. So maybe your group wants to stay informal. At the Law Center, sometimes it feels like our legal system only exists because people have forgotten to love each other. But since we are a law center, we're here to help you understand the law. Charlotte will now go into managing liability and risk. Stop share. Excellent. And you are a host, Charlotte. Yes, you can share.
And just confirming that you can see my screen.
Yes.
All right. So thanks, Tia, for providing that great overview and ending your section with a positive note. I think we are about just a little bit past the halfway mark, so I invite you to just take a deep breath and move around a little bit. This is a lot of dense information, and I'm about to talk about some not so rosy scenarios. So this is the part where I have to be the bearer of bad news and flag worst case scenarios. In law school, I actually learned that oftentimes lawyers are known as dream crushers. So I'm going to play that role for the next 5 minutes and hopefully end with some practical advice. So chances are many of the mutual aid groups that exist today, as Tia pointed out, are currently unincorporated and perhaps will remain unincorporated. And the risk of being sued, I think, might be relatively low. That's just coming from a perspective of how much enforcement work will be required to actually dock these mutual aid groups. So, however, as we said in the beginning, the movement will sometimes be served by ignoring the lawyers. Let's do a quick inventory though of what could go wrong. So some of you may remember this list from the last webinar if you were there, and let's discuss some of the scenarios that can come up when you are running a mutual aid fund or creating a resource of services for your community. One thing is that the recipients might not get the money that they're expecting. There could also be a misalignment of what the contributors are expecting out of the mutual aid and what's actually given. So for example, if they're expecting that 100% of their funds will go towards a recipient, and instead the mutual aid group uses part of that towards overhead costs. So there's some misalignment there of perhaps what the person donating was expecting. There's also the possibility of fraud and theft. We don't like to think about that, but it does sometimes happen. And there's also, in this current circumstance, the possibility of someone catching COVID, whether in whatever kind of interaction that was taking place as a result of a mutual aid effort. As organizers, though, there are a lot of different things that you can do to lower this liability risk. So I'll just, slide is a little bit dense, but let me break it down into 3 categories. And so the first category is just the different things you can do in your operations and building the culture of the mutual aid group. Tia mentioned establishing the mutual aid on the basis of trust and compassion. And so you can continue to cultivate that, because when there's a spirit of trust and collaboration, there's less likelihood of people suing each other. And from that, we can also build agreements that will be discussed later in the presentation. There's also some steps you can take from a process standpoint. So integrating standards into your volunteer training, for example, or making sure that everyone is clear about what the expectations are when they're signing up to participate to support this mutual aid group. That can mean wearing a mask at all times. That's the norm here in California, but it's actually not the standard for other states. So perhaps as a mutual aid group, you want to decide which public health guidelines you will be adhering to, and perhaps even exceed that in your local jurisdiction. Now, for the legal steps that you can take, number 4, creating a liability waiver. We'll talk about that shortly. Liability shield is what Tia discussed in the last section, and that's creating an entity. However, again, as she pointed out, that can actually be peers. But it's still something to consider if you are at a point where you think you'll be doing this for the long term. And finally, there's the option of purchasing general liability insurance. It would be ideal to have all of these in place, but realistically, we absolutely recognize that it's possible you only do a couple of these, and that's okay. We're here to share some of the options, and from there you can decide what's best and feasible for the group. For the lawyers out there, and also for the non-lawyers, I'm just going to go through a couple of legal defenses that are available in the law. First, for volunteers. So volunteers generally get greater liability protection, and this is available through the Federal Volunteer Protection Act. So the Volunteer Protection Act provides limited liability protection for volunteers so long as whatever they committed was not grossly negligent or willfully conducted, or the misconduct was not willful. This protection does not apply if the volunteers are compensated, with a small exception that they can be reimbursed for up to $500 for the year. Lastly, this immunity does not extend to the nonprofit itself. So let's talk about what the nonprofit group, what is available to the nonprofit group. So there's a doctrine called charitable immunity. And the idea is that because a nonprofit is doing good work, then that's a defense for, because they had good intention, then that can be a defense for the issue that has emerged. However, this doctrine has been abolished in a number of different states, unfortunately, including California. But states like Alabama or North Carolina, if you happen to be in those, still have some vestiges of this. So this varies greatly state by state, but it is something that might be available to you if you're, depending on which state you're in. Let's consider then the reality of mutual aid groups, where oftentimes the organizer is unpaid and the group itself is unincorporated. In this case, I would make the argument that the organizers should liken themselves in a legal defense as much as they can to a volunteer, because as we just learned, volunteers have greater liability protection, and there's more legal defenses available to them. And one of these is the Good Samaritan Law, or this body of laws called Good Samaritan laws that are state level laws. They are defined differently depending on, again, where you are, it's state specific, but generally it refers to individuals who provide assistance in good faith in an emergency and without compensation. I did a quick search of Good Samaritan laws in various states, and I found that oftentimes these laws are actually limited to healthcare providers. And in California, you'll find the Good Samaritan laws in the healthcare code. There are other states where this Good Samaritan law is defined more broadly, and it applies to any person who provides aid, and it's a potential defense in any liability situation. Even if there's no Good Samaritan law available to you, you can still try to come under the volunteer protection laws. We went over the federal one. Some states might actually have greater volunteer protection laws. They might expand the scope of the Federal Volunteer Protection Act. So we just went over some legal defenses. What if you are in a state like California that doesn't have a Good Samaritan law for a typical mutual aid organizer? Then I will say, let's look at some of the steps that we reviewed in a couple of slides prior, including creating a liability waiver. So I will admit that when I was tasked with this section, my brain started to go into overdrive a little bit. And so I've laid out some key steps here that organizers can take to help wrap their heads around what this process could look like. So first, I would suggest going ahead and checking out some samples. I've linked those samples here in the slides if you're following along. We here at Sustainable Economies Law Center, we're also trying to create some samples, hopefully with some cartoons to make them a little bit more interesting to read. Then the next step would be to customize those samples. They don't have to be 10-page documents, and in fact, I would encourage them to be really short and to the point. that way they can be actually, there's a, for a liability waiver or any contract to be enforceable, a court will actually want to make sure that these provisions were conspicuous, so not difficult to read, not hidden in the language. So all that to say, I skipped ahead to number 4, making the agreement and the liability waiver actually easy to digest and read. And the third step that I skipped over is to integrate this, obviously, into your process, making sure that every volunteer that comes through your doors reads this, and perhaps you start keeping records of emergency contacts that can be included in the waiver. So what are some other things that you can include in a liability waiver? Besides the actual, I release the nonprofit from whatever injury comes to me, that standard language, we would also encourage you to include a statement of purpose and reminding them of the values that brought you together in the first place. That's not so much legally required, but actually just fosters a greater alignment of expectations between the volunteers and the nonprofit. This section here on how to customize it, which I referenced just in the last slides, we would also encourage you to think about the different scenarios and risks that might be specific to your mutual aid operations and adding that to the waiver. That way people are aware of what possible worst case scenarios can come out of it. And there's also, personally, I don't handle insurance. I have not done a great deal of insurance or getting insurance quotes, but I did look into what our insurance premium is at the Sustainable Economies Law Center and did a quick search of just the wide range of premium costs out there is. And what I found is that this can be anywhere between $500 a year to $5,000 a year or more. And it depends on what activity you're involved in. At the Law Center, we're primarily doing computer work at the office or our homes, which is the norm now that we're all working from home. And our general liability insurance premium is $550. We've also made the decision to purchase cyber liability insurance, which I believe is another $550 a year or somewhere around there. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Tia, who will talk about privacy and data security.
Awesome, thank you, Charlotte. Okay, so I learned this really fast this week, so if anyone knows that I'm wrong, please say so. Feel free. I will not be offended at all. I'm trying to share my screen now. Does everyone see number 6, privacy and security?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so, well, for obvious reasons, a lot of the mutual aid organizing during COVID is online. And when it comes to online privacy and security, people usually ask us about 3 things: laws that they must follow, laws that pertain to identity theft, and best practices to keep their community safe. And we're only going over the first 2 today, but for organizing purposes, please note this resource. The Electronic Frontier Foundation published a detailed article about keeping each other safe when virtually organizing mutual aid. Click here to learn about how to prevent phishing, doxing, unwanted government collection of data, selling of data, and more. Hopefully, after reading the best practices guide, your group can avoid falling victim to identity theft. But if an identity thief does target your group, there are California and federal protections in place. One is that law enforcement agencies are required to take a police report when a victim reports identity theft. And then you can take that police report to dispute fraudulent transactions and make creditors stop collecting debts. If a creditor doesn't stop harassing you, then you could actually sue them. Under federal law, you also have a right to place fraudulent alerts on your credit report. The Federal Trade Commission has a handy booklet that explains identity theft victim rights, and there's a link in the slides. And also in California, mutual aid groups and associations, organizations, partnerships all have the same rights as an individual to contest any debt that has resulted from identity theft. Now for laws that your group has to follow. If your group operates a website that collects personal information on California consumers, you must conspicuously post a privacy policy on the site. The privacy policy must, among other things, identify the types of personally identifiable information collected about site visitors and the kinds of third parties with whom you might share that information. On this slide, you can click to see our privacy policy at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, just as an example. And this privacy policy is by law also on the footer of our website if you go to our website. And to make it conspicuous, we put the sentence in all caps. It says, check out our privacy policy here. And my coworker Ricardo actually made me do that because first I didn't make it conspicuous enough. Thank you, Ricardo, he's here watching. You can also find an example that might be more relevant of a privacy policy of a mutual aid group on this slide. And just another thing to note is the Graham-Leach-Bliley rule, which requires financial institutions to issue privacy notices to their customers that explain their information sharing practices and give customers an opportunity to opt out of sharing their information. And in the comment section of these slides, you could also click to see if your mutual aid organization qualifies as a financial institution. It probably doesn't, but you can check. In California, you must notify folks if you own personal information data that has been breached by an unauthorized person. Personal information means an individual's name plus one or more of the following: their social security numbers, their driver's license number, financial account numbers, medical info, etc. You must also notify someone if their user ID and password were accessed by a third party. And when you do notify someone, the notice must contain specific information. So we included the template in the slides as well. And if this happens to more than 500 of your members and they're all California residents, then you have to actually tell the Attorney General that it happened. And it's also a simple form that we linked on the slides. And I think this is the last slide we have. This one is about domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking privacy. So the Secretary of State in California has a confidential address program called Safe at Home, and it's for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and also for reproductive health care providers. And if a Safe at Home participant gives you a written request to remove their personal information from your search engine, you must do so immediately. And it's just nice to do. Like I said, I learned all of these laws pretty recently. The Office of the Attorney General luckily has a comprehensive list of California and federal privacy laws. I looked through them, tried to pull out what might be relevant for a mutual aid group. But please read the complete list here, also on the slide. And that's it. And then we have a list of resources for all of you to check out. I'm gonna stop sharing now. Excellent. So that is the end of our presentation. And since we have a pretty small group of people, I think we could start with Q&A here. And if it turns out that the questions are too diverse, then we'll break it out into themes. So anyone with a question?
And are we just going to collect the questions for now and then decide? Or are we going to collect a question and answer? And okay, I see.
Yes, if you have questions, please type them in and then we'll decide based on how different the questions are, whether we need to break into breakout rooms.
I see. So you don't want people to unmute themselves?
You could also unmute yourself.
Okay, cool.
And you can also stop recording in case people are afraid that their question is recorded.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.